All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome to the first targeted election prediction video for 2020. I'm going to periodically be updating for various candidates my own forecast, my own predictions for those specific races. And we're going to be looking today at Trump versus Sanders first. The reason I've listed him is that Sanders is a Democrat / independent is because Sanders is probably not going to he's not going to tread in the exactly as a Democrat. So I don't think it's fair to list him as a pure Democrat. He is running as a Democratic candidate, obviously, but I don't think it's 100% fair. And I've basically taken out all of the safe states with two exceptions, which I'm going to get to immediately. And that's New Mexico, which I think for all intents and purposes, I'm going to say New Mexico is going to go blue for, by a decent margin, and Delaware, which is not really considered a swing state. However, I've been saying it's been getting a lot closer for years and years now, so I think it's, or not years, but I've been saying it's been getting closer since I noticed a few weird things in the polling numbers that I've seen for it. For example, Delaware statewide approval rating tracks almost exactly with for Donald Trump, tracks almost exactly with the national approval rating, except a slight bit in favor of disapprove, depending on the pollster. Morning Consult almost has it exactly the same, Delaware statewide approval, or even slightly ahead of their national approval rating for Delaware. So I think it's going to be a lot more competitive, but it's still definitely going to go to Sanders in this circumstance. And let's talk about two Republican exceptions as well, which is Texas and Georgia. Texas is starting to trend towards the Democrats, but I'm still extremely confident about that. Not confident enough to say it's 100% safe. I do see that there are one or two scenarios where a Democrat and even Bernie Sanders could win the state. For example, a complete market collapse or something like that. Georgia, similar issue, except it's going to be a little bit closer in terms of percentages. But it's much harder to move voters in Georgia just because there aren't that many swing voters. There aren't a lot of independents in Georgia. Most of the vote is pretty much predetermined. The Republican floor is pretty much 48%, and the Democratic floor is pretty much 42 or 43%. You're not really going to get too much swing off of that. So it requires an extremely strong Democrat in Georgia plus a perfect storm in order for the Democrat to win a statewide race in Georgia, right? So that pretty much evens everything out, right? So let's start talking about these, and let's talk about them in... We'll go from... this is a tough one. Let's just start with North Carolina. I think Donald Trump has an advantage there. I'm just looking at polls, if you can see here, and I've been just doing some mental calculations on all the polls that I'm looking at. And this is a surprisingly competitive race. I'd say the average is maybe a point in Sanders' favor. And given what I have seen about the Electoral College and the way that each state votes and their partisanship leans, that's not enough for him to win. He needs to win by about 4 to 5% in order to secure the Electoral College, because there is a slight trend in the Republicans' favor in a lot of the states, but in a lot of the, say, your Californias, your Washingtons, your New Yorks, the population disparity in the popular vote is so significant that it's able to outweigh small victories in swing states and allows a Republican to win the Electoral College while losing the popular vote. I think that's kind of a unique circumstance in this era. I don't think that's going to be the trend going forward. I definitely think that In the future, the popular vote in the Electoral College, they're going to wind up converging again like it was for the vast majority of our nation's history. This is just a very weird time in American politics, in terms of where the votes are located in the Electoral College that make it that kind of make the balance, in my opinion, a little bit off, at least in terms of the historical effect. Anyway, Florida. I'm going to actually, under normal circumstances, I tilt it because it's, under normal circumstances, it'd be an extremely close race. But when you have Florida Democrats calling out Sanders' comments, singing the praises of Fidel Castro, no, just no. I've always made the joke that if the Democrats nominated someone named Castro, say Julian or Joaquin, they'd lose Florida. Well, you have somebody praising Fidel Castro, and you have Democrats calling him out on that. I don't see how Sanders can win Florida now. And that is really important because Florida is kind of the Republicans. First, you have to win Florida. Second, you have to win Ohio. Once you win those two states, you can then think about winning the general election. If you can't win those two states, you're not winning. Because it's really hard. Let me just put it back in toss-up for a second. It's really hard to find states that you can win that add up to 270 without getting Florida and Ohio. For example, let's just throw these states in. That just does it, but you're going to win Ohio and you're going to win Florida if you're winning Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Virginia. So there's just you're not. So you do have to take care of your ground in. Okay, let's say you win here, you win here. Say you win Maine statewide. That's still only 240. So you're going to need there's your other 40. And again, it's just such a weird map that it's not going to happen. So you do, as a Republican, absolutely have to win Florida. And Sanders has basically served Florida up on a map to whoever the Republican nominee is. Let me resend that. Okay. Right? So let's also get this second district out of the way. The voters there are extremely moderate from what I know about them. I'm still only leaning it because it should be a somewhat competitive race. But Sanders, I think, is just too far to the left to appeal to the general electorate in a fairly moderate district that will flip between Republicans and Democrats. And that's the problem I have with Sanders in terms of his ability to win in the general election, is that he's just way too far to the left and way too cozy with certain totalitarians, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, Fidel Castro, the Castros in Cuba, various Soviet dictatorships. I mean, when you're saying that bread lines are good for a nation and it's good that people are that people are starving, that they're lining up to get food rather than just walking into a store, picking what they want and paying for it. No, Bernie, what are you doing, brother? What are you doing? Arizona, basically the same thing. I don't think I don't think a Sanders can win in Arizona just yet. We may see a slightly wider race than 2016 if Sanders is a nominee. And honestly, it's such a... and my basis on that is that Kyrsten Sinema is an extremely moderate Democrat. She is one of the more pro-Trump Democrats, at least in terms of voting record. Yeah, she voted for both articles of impeachment. She voted to convict. But I think that was more because she had to in order to remain in the good graces of her party and not face a primary challenge in her next election in 24. But I don't think she really needed to worry too much. She could have actually voted. I mean, Joe Manchin had the same conundrum. He really didn't want to vote for the Articles either. I think Doug Jones just did it anyway because he recognized that he was going to lose that race, but whatever. Arizona it's a state that will reward people who are willing to work across the lines, and Sanders just doesn't seem to be interested in doing that. And again, he is too far to the left for the state. And I think I forgot to remove Virginia. Sorry about that. That was not a call on Virginia, by the way. Let's look at Colorado. This is a state that is becoming more and more Democratic as the years go by. And it's a state that I honestly believe will more than likely go to Sanders regardless. Its Democratic base is just larger than the Republican base these days, and the moderates tend to favor slightly more liberal policies. Its swing voters tend to favor more liberal policies these days. So I don't really, or more liberal in the American sense of the word rather than the political science sense of the word. So Colorado moderates tend to like the Democratic Party these days. So I really don't think Trump might win it, but I'm fairly confident that the Democrat's going to win it. Similar story with Nevada. I think it has a larger Democratic lean than I think a lot of pollsters will give it. And it's just very difficult for a Republican to win a statewide election in that state as it stands. Things could obviously change, right? So now we've got the rest of these states, and we're going to talk about them. So Minnesota, I'm only leaning it because Minnesota, as well as the rest of the Rust Belt and Upper Midwest, has been getting more and more GOP friendly since the 90s. Mostly because their populations are more aging, they're admittedly whiter, and that it does matter, and they tend not to have as much higher education. And that's not to say that smart people vote Democrat. I'm basically going for my master's right now, sort of, kind of. I'm certainly going to have enough credits to get a master's, but I'm working on trying to get my teaching cert, but that's beside the point. It's not that smart people vote Democratic. I'm certainly not a Democrat. And it's more that the higher level of formal education a person has, the more likely they are to vote Democratic. I know a lot of smart people who don't have a very high level of education yet could probably run circles around some professors in terms of their intelligence. And they're extremely conservative. Of course, I also know some that are some people who are the other way in terms of politics, but, again, don't have a very high level of education. And then, of course, I know college professors who are, quite frankly, dumb as a box of rocks. So it's not that smart people vote Democratic, it's more that formal education tends to push people to the left. And there are many, many reasons for that, and I'm not going to get into them here. That might be an episode of my political soapbox at some point in the future, but we'll talk about that on some future date, right? But Minnesota is a little bit more highly educated than the rest of the states in the Rust Belt and Upper Midwest, but again, it's still getting more and more GOP friendly, especially as the rural-urban divide takes over, and suburbs in Minnesota they're slightly more conservative. Minnesota is one of those states that used to be solid Dem, but really never went for the super progressive social politics of the Democratic Party. And, so be it, right? Sorry about that. I just noticed something that was on my shirt that I didn't like. Anyway, so let's talk, let's move on to Virginia. Okay, now all y'all know I live here in the Commonwealth, and I think some of y'all know that I have people I know people from all parts of the state, and I try and take, I try and gather as much in-person observation as I can in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I took a trip up to the Nova area this weekend for purposes unrelated to politics, but I decided to sit down and get as much observation as I could. And I tried to avoid conversations, but I did get looped into some, and I just, picked some people's minds, and there's no enthusiasm for the Democratic Party right now, which is really weird considering they just had the major victory last November in the state legislature, the House of Delegates and the state Senate. Combine that with their pretty much complete domination of statewide races, you'd think they'd have some momentum for finally, certainly flipping what used to be one of the more solid GOP states. Yet it seems like the Democrats I spoke to, it seems they're still worried that the state is too conservative for someone as far to the party's left as Sanders. And a lot of them thought that Bloomberg would absolutely doom the Democratic Party in Virginia if he were to be the nominee. Which is weird because I've been noticing that the Commonwealth is one of those states that it just seemed lost to the GOP for a long time. And then the GOP has basically gotten a perfect storm of a potential socialist who won't really appeal to, say, your Prince William County voters or your Loudoun County voters, and certainly not to your Virginia Beach voters in some of the suburbs of Norfolk. Certainly won't appeal out here because he's too socially progressive. It'll really only appeal to the college students and the progressives in, say, Alexandria and Richmond. And that's just not enough to carry the state. You have to have Nova and at least some of Tidewater. You can't just have Nova and Richmond and Norfolk. You have to have some of the other towns in those areas. You've got to have Fairfax. You got to have Manassas. You got to have Prince William County. You got to have Loudoun County. You have to have Williamsburg. You have to have. You don't need Virginia Beach, but it certainly helps. You need to be able to hold on to some of these suburbs, and someone too far to the left is not going to be able to do it in Virginia, from my own observations. And I know anecdotal evidence isn't, perfect, but looking at the polls, it looks to be a lot closer, and Sanders might have a lot of trouble, and probably will have a lot of trouble if he doesn't nominate a Virginian for his vice presidential pick, and I don't think that's likely. I think he's going to go with somebody who is slightly more progressive and, a little bit, and probably from the Rust Belt, Upper Midwest, or maybe the Southwest. And I think part of that is because Virginia just doesn't have the clout that it used to. But I don't know. I think Virginia is still an important state when it comes to the political future of America, but we'll have to see how that goes. So, and I think that a lot of voters in the rural areas in the non-super urban centers who were extremely pissed and are passing all these Second Amendment sanctuary counties, they don't care who the nominee is going to be. They're going to turn out to vote in favor of Donald Trump regardless, just to prove to the Democrats that you can't tell us that we can't have guns. Because that seems to be the only thing the Virginia Democratic Party seems interested in is gun control. When most of the people who voted for them in, the gubernatorial race in 2017 and the House of Delegates race in 2019, as well as state Senate in 2019, a lot of them voted for Democrats for, Medicaid expansion, legal marijuana, stuff like that. Most of them weren't focused on gun control. So when the Democrats immediately went for gun control, a lot of the people who were on the fence and were in favor of some of these policies but still like their guns, were like, whoa, what the, what the bleep are you doing? So it's a very mixed state, and I would like to put it as true toss up, just so that people who are viewing this who are unacquainted with my channel won't say, "Oh, he has a pro-Trump bias." No, I live here. There is a non-zero chance that we have 90% turnout in some of these rural counties, which would almost certainly be enough to flip the state if we were able to flip, say, or even just make Loudoun County and Prince William County closer than they have been in the past few elections. Not just presidential, but I'm including gubernatorial, etc. Since about 2010, if those counties are just a little bit closer and the rural counties have a significantly higher turnout, that would be enough to flip the state. Just barely, but it would be enough. So, and I think that actually might happen, and I think it's non-zero that if Sanders is a nominee, that Loudoun actually goes red. So it's going to be significantly closer, and I think that is enough to just barely flip Virginia. So I'm putting it as a tilt, which means it's true toss-up, but I think Trump would be ever so slightly favored here. Now let's go to New Hampshire, which has some mixed polling from what I've seen. I think because it's a New England state, and I'm doing the same thing for Maine, except it's going to be a little bit closer. Maybe not. I'm tilting both towards Sanders, but I think they're both states that will be competitive. And I guess we should talk about these 4 states again, or I guess we should talk about these 4 states now. Iowa, I think will narrowly go towards Trump, and I'm actually going to give Ohio to Trump. Those just seem to be Iowa and Ohio really went heavy for Trump, much more so than I think everybody was expecting. And obviously this puts Trump over the top, 273 obviously, but these states are certainly awkward. It was really weird to see them go so heavily for Donald Trump in 2016. And I don't think Sanders can undo all of that movement, especially with the economy being as strong as it is. Yes, we've had, a few bad days in a row on the markets, but the economy is more than just the stock market. And most of that can be reasonably attributed to fears over the coronavirus, which is, I think people are over panicking on that. But who knows? And I guess we'll talk about Wisconsin now, which would certainly open up the door for a Trump victory, even if he loses Virginia. And I've been saying this since, I think, 2017, that Wisconsin is the Democrats' version of Virginia. Basically, it's a blue state that all of a sudden went Republican in a few statewide races, and then all of a sudden went red in a presidential election. And the Democrats are just barely clinging on in statewide races. And again, with a strong economy and with the way it seems Wisconsin voters, because I've read a few articles and looking at the polling data, it looks like Democrats are going to have trouble in Wisconsin in 2020. Tony Evers won against Scott Walker, but it was an extremely narrow victory, and there was probably some fatigue over Scott Walker. So I'm going to tilt Wisconsin towards Trump, but I think that Trump will win Wisconsin. Michigan, I think 2016 was a bit too soon, and I think I think 2020 would have been a bit too soon. If Trump were more popular, I think he'd carry it easily. When I say easily, I mean it'd still be extremely competitive, but he wouldn't be in a position to really lose it unless the economy completely collapsed. You know, consumer confidence went down, inflation went up, unemployment went up, etc. And Pennsylvania is a really weird state. I think Clinton basically maxed out Philadelphia in 2016, and Philadelphia and two of the suburban counties, and actually three of the suburban counties, which are going to be more competitive. I believe it was Bucks, Lancaster, and I forget the names of the counties, but Bucks was the one I remember. I just don't think that there are enough votes in Philly to outvote the rest of the state, which is probably going to vote even more heavily for Trump, and especially with less third-party effect, predominantly from the Libertarian Party, which is much closer to the GOP than it is to the Democratic Party. That should aid Trump a little bit as well. So, again, I'm tilting it because it could be extremely competitive, and the truth is, any state that's in this tilt category could flip the other direction. It just kind of depends on where most of the numbers are leaning, etc. And the other thing I'm looking at with the polls is looking at how many undecideds there are, which tend to break more Republican. The other thing I'm doing is I'm factoring in that support around Trump and Sanders hasn't 100% solidified because of the nature of primaries, where an incumbent, there are a lot of people who say, well, it depends on who the opposing nominee is going to be, but that's kind of the way I think it's going to boil down to, is we're going to have 303 versus 235, which is very close to what Trump won in 16. I think Sanders probably should get the popular vote by about 1.5% to 2%, but it won't be large enough popular vote victory to win the Electoral College. Anyway, I want to thank all y'all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you guys next time. Take it easy. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.